was sharp, scented with pine and wood smoke, when Evelyn Hart stepped onto her porch, coffee steaming in her hands. Frost clung to the edges of the grass, glinting in the early light. From the tree line, a sound broke the stillness, a thin, desperate cry. She froze. Out of the shadowed woods, a small, smoke-colored bobcat cub staggered into view, ribs showing beneath matted fur, paws too big for its trembling body. It swayed, eyes locking on hers, then crumpled onto the gravel. She didn't know it yet, but bringing him inside would change everything. Evelyn Hart's mornings had a rhythm as predictable as the sun's slow climb over the mountains. Her small, cedar-sided home sat on the edge of a wide clearing in western Montana, where the forest pressed close but didn't quite touch the porch. The front steps faced east toward a line of pines that looked black until the first light struck them, turning their needles to gold. Most days, she would sit here, wrapped in an old wool cardigan, fingers curled around a mug, watching the frost steam off the grass. October always brought a particular kind of stillness. The birds were fewer now, their songs softened or gone altogether. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke drifting from far-off chimneys. When the wind stirred, it carried the dry rustle of aspen leaves that clung stubbornly to their branches, as though unwilling to surrender to the coming winter. Evelyn had lived here for 6 years. But in the last year, the place had taken on a different weight. Her husband, Daniel, had been the one who'd first fallen in love with this piece of land. He'd talked about the mountains like they were old friends, how their moods shifted with the weather, how they kept secrets in the folds of their ridges. When they'd moved in, he'd strung a wind chime from the porch beam, the kind made of driftwood and river stones, and told her, "Even when it's quiet here, the air should sing." Since he'd gone, the wind chime hardly moved. It wasn't that the wind had stopped, it was that the sound no longer reached her the same way. The days had become long, unbroken stretches of muted color and muffled sound. She still painted. She had to, because stopping would feel like losing another piece of herself. But the canvases leaned against the wall in silent rows, unfinished. Her evenings were quiet in the way that made a house feel larger than it was. She'd stopped keeping the radio on while she cooked. She'd stopped talking out loud except for the occasional "excuse me" to a kitchen chair she bumped into. She had been content, or told herself she was. Solitude, after all, wasn't the same as loneliness, or so she'd believed. That morning had begun like all the others. She'd padded barefoot across the creaking floorboards, brewed her coffee, and opened the front door to the sharp bite of cold. Steam curled upward from her mug as she stepped onto the porch. From here, she could see the pale mist hugging the low ground beyond the clearing, the shadows between the pines still holding the last of the night. A squirrel chattered somewhere high in the trees. In the soft mud near the porch steps, she noticed faint prints, a scatter of tiny pads and claw marks. They weren't new. She'd seen similar ones over the past week, always heading toward the edge of the woods, always vanishing into the undergrowth. She thought little of it. Life here meant sharing the land. She'd spotted deer slipping through the clearing at dusk, a fox once trotting along the fence line, even a black bear far off near the creek one spring morning. She respected their distance, and they respected hers. That unspoken agreement made what happened next all the more strange. As she sipped her coffee, the forest seemed to shift. The chatter of the squirrel cut short. A sudden, brittle silence spread outward, the way water stills when a shadow passes overhead. Then, faint, almost lost in the distance, a sound. It wasn't the bark of a fox or the high-pitched squeal of a rabbit. It was smaller, more fragile. A thin, reedy cry that snagged in the air before fading. Evelyn's hand paused halfway to her mouth. She listened, her breath fogging in the cold. Again it came, closer this time. Her gaze followed the dark fringe of the forest until she saw it, movement low to the ground, weaving through the grass. For a heartbeat, she thought it was a stray house cat, thin frame, mottled fur. But as it broke into the open, the truth unraveled that thought entirely. Its coat was patterned with faint rosettes, its ears tipped with black tufts, its eyes wide and searching. The paws, far too large for its spindly legs, sank into the frost-hardened earth, a bobcat cub. She knew enough about the wild to understand that seeing one alone was wrong. A mother would never let her young stray this far without reason. The cub's steps were uneven, stumbling. Its fur clung in damp spikes, and the sharp line of its ribs showed with each breath. Evelyn stood frozen on the porch, the steam from her coffee rising between them like a pale veil. The cub stopped a few yards away, swaying slightly. Its gaze locked on hers, not with the wary calculation of an adult predator, but with something else. Something that looked like exhaustion. The moment stretched. Her first instinct was to retreat inside, to let the wild stay wild. That's what the signs at the ranger station always said: do not approach, do not feed. She told herself she would watch for a moment, then go back inside. But then the cub took one step forward, and another. Its front paw folded oddly as it stepped, and it stumbled, catching itself at the last moment. The movement tugged at something deep in her chest. She thought of Daniel's last winter, when even the short walk from the couch to the kitchen had left him winded. That same stubborn, quiet determination to keep going, even when the body wanted to give out. The cub swayed once more. Then, without a sound, it crumpled onto the gravel of her driveway. The coffee mug slipped from her hand, the dark liquid blooming across the frost-white ground. She was already moving down the steps before she realized what she meant to do. The cold air caught in her throat as she crossed the yard, crouching beside the small, still shape. Up close, she could see the fine trembling along its sides, the way its breathing shivered in and out. Its eyes fluttered open, catching a shaft of pale light. They were the color of wet moss. Her flannel overshirt came off in one motion. She wrapped it around the cub, careful of the tiny claws that snagged weakly at the fabric. Beneath the wild, musky scent of its fur, there was the faint, metallic tang of hunger. She hesitated only once, glancing toward the woods as though expecting to see a shadow moving there. But there was nothing, only the still, watching trees. The cub's head tipped against her arm. Evelyn turned toward the house, the weight in her arms almost nothing at all. And yet, as she stepped onto the porch, she felt as though she were carrying something far heavier. She told herself it was just until she could call someone, just until she knew what to do. But in some quiet, unspoken place inside her, she already sensed that the moment she crossed the threshold, something in her life had shifted. That morning, the woods didn't keep their distance. The door sighed shut behind her, sealing out the cold. Warm breath rose from the vent in the hallway, a ribbon of heat that lifted the edge of the flannel. The house smelled faintly of linseed oil and coffee, pine soap from last night's dishes. Evelyn crossed the living room in careful, sliding steps, as if any sudden movement might shatter the creature in her arms. He was lighter than he looked. Bones under fur, ribs like thin sticks. His tail, that blunt bob of it, flicked once and fell still. Ear tufts trembled, his whiskers quivered against the blue plaid like white grass in a wind. She set him on the braided rug near the wood stove. The stove was off. She hadn't lit it yet, but the morning heat from the furnace rose steadily. She crouched. opened the flannel just enough to see his face. The eyes, clouded but lucid, tracked her. No hiss, no growl. A sound instead that was almost nothing. A thread of air shaped into a chirp. "Hey," she whispered, voice catching in her throat. "I've got you." She moved in the practiced, quiet way that grief had taught her. Open the cupboard with the chipped enamel bowls. Fill one with water from the kettle, warm, not hot. Another with plain, unsalted chicken she kept for soups. She broke it into flecks with her fingers. Her hands smelled like fat and metal. She washed them, dried them on the dish towel that still had Daniel's paint smudge from the week he'd tried to help stretch canvases and quit in laughter. When she returned, the cub had shifted a few inches, dragging the flannel with him. He lay stretched along the fringe of the rug, belly flat on the weave to pull the heat. The paws were too big. The pads were dry and cracked like tiny deserts. A burr was lodged in the fur behind his foreleg. She pinched it free. He flinched, then stilled. She slid the water close. He ignored it at first, eyes half shut. Then caught the scent, lifted his head in a small shaking arc and drank. His tongue, rough and quick, tapped the rim. He drank as if the idea of stopping was dangerous. When the bowl rattled against the floorboards, he jerked and froze, breath held, the wild memory of danger lighting every nerve. Evelyn's hand hovered, then lowered, palm open on the rug. Her fingers didn't touch him. They offered nearness without demand. He finished the water, sat back on his haunches, awkward. The short tail made a soft thud against the rug. He leaned toward the chicken, sniffed, took one shred, and then devoured the rest with a ferocity that felt too large for his thin body. Halfway through, he paused, as if honesty demanded it, and made a small growl to remind the world, "Predator." The sound startled her smile into being. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." The window over the sink faced the clearing. Frost still hung in pockets where the sun hadn't yet found the blades. Beyond, the pines held their green like a secret. She stood there a moment, watching the edge of the woods. No movement. No shadow pacing. No mother tracking her child's scent to the porch. Just the quiet morning and the low hum of the furnace and the faint clink of the enamel bowl as the cub nudged it for one last scrap. She moved to the hall closet and pulled out a folded wool blanket. Not the knit one, Daniel's. She couldn't give that yet. She chose the grey, the one with the thin black stripe, the one they'd found in a thrift store that smelled of cedar and old rain. She carried it to the wood stove and spread it near the vent, laying it in a soft crescent. The cub watched with the grave attention of the exhausted. He shifted toward the warmth, as if the floor had tilted him there. "Here," she murmured, "this is better." He put his head down but did not close his eyes. She recognized it, that stage of alertness that lives on the edge of collapse. He had traveled beyond the point where sleep was a choice. It would take him. He was only waiting to be convinced the ground would hold. She fetched the first aid kit, not for bandages, for the tiny eyedropper she'd used once for a neighbor's abandoned kitten. She filled it with water, sat on the floor, thighs pinched by the cold through her jeans, and offered a careful drop to the corner of his mouth. He accepted it. Another. Another. Between drops, a small rumble began and surprised them both. A purr, low and broken like a motor starting after a long winter. "Well, look at you," she said. "The words barely air." The sound made the wind chime on the porch answer with one faint clack of stone against stone. The house inhaled, exhaled. When the water and chicken were gone, the tremor in his flanks slowed. The pupils narrowed from midnight coins to something gentler. He let his head tip until it rested on her knuckles before memory lifted it again. He watched the doorway. He watched the windows. He watched the small breath of the curtain when the furnace clicked on. Wild remained wild, even when weakness stole its power. She knew she should call someone, the ranger station or the wildlife rehab place near Kalispell that kept its number taped to the bulletin board at the feed store. She even reached for her phone, thumbed it awake. The screen lit her palm with a cold glow. She didn't dial. Instead, she opened a browser window and searched for what she already knew. Do not feed wildlife, do not keep wildlife, do not rescue unless instructed. The words lined up like a wall. She read them all. Every sentence was true. And yet, she looked at him. The two big paws, the pale places where fur had thinned under hunger's hand, the way each breath negotiated with his ribs. He blinked slowly. Not a house cat's lazy blink, a slower, heavier thing, as if the lids had to consider the journey. "Just for today," she said. "Just for today we do this." She warmed a towel in the dryer. When she draped it near him, he slid 1 inch closer, then another, until his chest pressed the warmed cotton. He laid his chin on the edge, as if the towel's softness were a riverbank, and he had finally found water. Mid-morning, light shifted across the floor. The house changed its sound as it always did, pipes clicking, a distant truck on the county road, a jay scolding the cold. She made tea she didn't drink. She washed the enamel bowls and set them to dry. She moved slowly because the spell required it. The first sleep took him sideways, 1 breath, and then he was not there. His body stayed. The wild inside him had gone to a place with grasses and mice and a mother's milk, and it pulled him deep. His paws twitched, a whisker jerked, a soft chirp escaped and disappeared like mist. She used that hour to look closer. She sat near his haunches, not touching. She counted the ribs, too many. She looked at the pads, cracked, but not bleeding. The left forepaw, the one that folded earlier, didn't swell. The ear tips were clean. Burrs freed from the fur lay like tiny stars on the rug. He was not sick from a wound. He was sick from the long, quiet war of hunger. Outside, a wind rose and worried the porch chime into a hesitant song. The world beyond the glass remained indifferent. A hawk lifted on the back field and hung there in the pale sky. Evelyn watched it watch the grass. She felt the old ache, the one that bent time into long loops. In the reflection on the glass, she saw herself, hair unbrushed, cardigan skewed, worry pulling her mouth's corners down. She placed her palm flat on the window and spread her fingers as if measuring the world's distance. His sleep broke with a small start, the kind that looks like falling. He opened his eyes, saw the room again, saw her, and did not startle further. He took a breath that settled lower than the ones before. He lifted his nose, sampling the air, the scent of tea, the ghost of chicken, pine soap, her. He shifted his back legs under him, gathered, and tried to stand. The effort was too much. He sank. The frustration was quick and hot. It flashed in a small sound that was not quite a hiss, not quite a cry. She answered it with something simple, a strip of fabric, soft and warm, not the grey blanket, a scarf this time, indigo, frayed at the ends from years of use. She twisted it into a nest and slid it close. He put a paw on it, claimed it, drew it under his chest with the clumsy dignity of the young. The scarf's fringe clung to his fur like grass seeds clinging to a traveler's sock. Noon came. The sun lifted over the pines and poured a bright square onto the floorboards. He inched into it, one forepaw then the other, and let the light make a shallow bath along his spine. In the sun, she could see the colors of him, smoke gray and russet, faint spots like raindrops on dust. A wild cat, yes. A child, too. Her phone buzzed, a text from her neighbor Mabel asking if she needed anything from town. Evelyn looked at the cub, then at the message, then at her hands. She typed, "All good, thanks." It wasn't the whole truth, it was the part she could carry. She reheated the kettle. Steam drifted. She shredded a little more chicken, less this time, spaced between sips of water from the dropper so his stomach wouldn't revolt. He ate, slower now, after he cleaned his paws with small, deliberate strokes. The gesture, ordinary, private, landed in her chest like a stone in water. Rings moved outward from it. The room rearranged around those rings. The day did too. When he finished, he lifted his gaze to her face and held it. Not a challenge, a weighing. She met it, did not look away. After a beat, he lowered his head and closed his eyes with the clear decision of someone who has chosen a place. She should call. She knew it. She would, in an hour, after one more sleep. After the light moved another foot across the floor. After the house remembered how to hold a heartbeat, not its own. She drew the curtain a little to dim the glare. She turned the thermostat 2 degrees warmer. She crossed to the studio doorway and, without stepping in, reached to pull a clean white canvas from the stack. Set it gently against the wall near the stove where the light could find it later. The sight of that blank field steadied her. It also frightened her in the smallest, sweetest way. From the vent, warm air lifted a strand of his fur. It rose, fell, rose again. She watched his sides expand and settle, counted, the number steadied. Outside, a thin cloud pulled a veil across the sun, the room cooled by a breath. She tucked the edge of the indigo scarf closer to his chest. "Tonight," she said, the decision arriving on its own feet, soft but sure. "You stay tonight." The wind chime answered from the porch with a bright single note, as if it had been waiting for a cue. She told herself it was just for the night. By afternoon, the light softened, turning the living room boards to honey. The cub slept and woke in small tides, each time surfacing with a soft chirp, as if checking that the world he'd chosen was still here. It was. Evelyn kept the room quiet. Kettle on low. Footsteps gentle. The house learned the rhythm of 2 heartbeats again. She began to call him Ash. The name came without searching, the way the color of dusk arrives, quiet and inevitable. His coat held that smoke-gray tone, scattered with faint spots like cooled embers. When she spoke it, Ash, he flicked an ear, and after the second day his head would lift, green eyes finding her even before the sound finished being a sound. Their days formed a pattern, small as thread, but strong. Morning. Light pours in as she opens the curtains. Steam ghosts from her mug. She kneels by the vent and feels for warmth, checks the bowls, warms a towel and the indigo scarf. Ash watches from the blanket, chin on its edge, as if the scarf were a shoreline and he, careful, was crossing. Midday, water in the dropper, then tiny pieces of chicken spaced out like steps on a path. Between bites, he pauses to breathe, to look, to listen. The listening is large. The house's voice becomes a map. Pipes, wind chime, the soft click of the thermostat, the slow whisk of her brush when she tests paint on a strip of paper. Painting returned to her in pieces. At first, she only set a clean canvas in the corner, letting sunlight rest on it. On the second morning, she drew a line across the white, the shape of the clearing's edge. On the third, she dragged a soft wash of pine shadow green. Ash, from his blanket, blinked in that slow, deliberate way that cats do when they insist the world is harmless for a heartbeat. She answered, 2 blinks, slower still. A new conversation. A ritual. By the end of a week, he would be near her studio door, paws tucked, watching her brush, float and land, float and land. Small trust came on quiet paws. The first time he ate with her palm near the bowl, not touching, only borrowing the space beside him. The first time her fingers grazed his whisker pad, and he didn't pull back, merely paused as if translating this strange language, contact, and then returned to the meat, chewing soft, eyes half closed. The first time he nosed the rim of the water bowl toward her as if to say, "Again, please." She laughed, a light, surprised sound that hadn't visited the house in months, and it felt like the room itself leaned closer to listen. He played in hesitant fragments. Ash didn't know toys. The jingle ball rolled past his nose without a glance, but a dust mote in a sunbeam. Sacred. He set his body low and slid forward 1 inch at a time, tail tip twitching, pupils blown wide at the miracle of floating light. He pounced and caught nothing, and seemed affronted by the physics of air. Then he tried again, a little more carefully, and this time he pinned the beam against the rug, satisfied, as if having corrected the world. The first mischief was quiet. She left the studio door ajar and returned to find a paintbrush dragged 3 feet from its jar, bristles gently masticated, a wet grey streak on the floor, like an accidental signature. Ash sat with a thread of indigo on his whisker and the solemn, startled look of a child caught trying on a parent's coat. "Not that one," she murmured, kneeling. She offered a soft pine cone instead, an old one from the windowsill, and rolled it. He tracked the wobble with reverence, pawed, patted, tucked it to his chest. Ownership declared. The brush, saved, went back to its jar. On the 4th morning, he met her at the bedroom door. Not close, 3 feet back, sitting tall as his bones allowed. A sound, small and questioning. She rose, heart doing that odd, warm kick, and opened. He turned and led the way down the hall, glancing back to make sure she came. In the kitchen, he stopped at the vent, at the scarf, at the bowls, then looked up as if to say, "We do the things now, yes?" Routine had become a bridge. They crossed it together, step by small step. Outside, the weather tilted toward winter. A thin rind of ice formed on the water glass she'd forgotten on the porch rail. The aspens dropped what leaves remained, laying coins of pale gold in the grass. One afternoon, wind arrived sudden and muscular, shouldering the trees and trembling the window glass. Ash stiffened, ears high, body compressed into a tense line. The wild in him stood up like a shadow. She lowered to the floor and slid her hand, palm down, onto the rug. Stillness. A slow blink. "It's only wind," she said softly, knowing the words were for her as much as him. The gust passed. The chime on the porch let go one deep, round note, and something in the room reset. The first time he came to her lap happened because of a feather. He found it near the back door, a small down feather that had slipped from the jacket she kept on the hook, a memory caught in thread. He worried it loose and carried it with a care that made his movements precise. Not quite a prowl, not quite a parade. He set it at her foot and sat, very straight, staring at the offering as if trying to will it into language. The feather lay, grey, soft, edged with faint light. She picked it up and placed it on the end of the indigo scarf. He blinked. The next day, he brought it again, from where he'd hidden it under the stove, and this time, when she extended her hand to take it, he stepped onto her shins and then onto her lap. a tentative, weightless placement of paws, followed by the uncertain fold of legs, the long sigh of a creature choosing rest. She did not breathe for a count of 5, then she did, carefully, and his body rose and fell with hers, and they borrowed breath. Nights found a shape too. She left the hallway light on low. She brushed her teeth, listening to the small sandpaper rhythm of his tongue as he cleaned paws in the living room. In bed, she kept to her side at first, expecting the emptiness to press the familiar ache. It didn't, not in the same way. On the 5th night, a wake came to the doorway, paused, then settled on the rug beside the bed, a warm comma at the end of the day's sentence. He didn't climb up, neither did she invite it. They slept close enough to hear each other. It was enough. She texted Mabel back eventually with a simple request. "Do you still have that old pet scale from when you fostered?" Mabel, cheerful even through a phone, replied an hour later, "I'll leave it at your gate. Everything okay?" Evelyn stared at the blinking cursor and typed, "Mostly. Thank you." She weighed Ash that evening by slipping a towel over the scale and setting a bowl of water within sight. He stepped on, drank, and stayed long enough. Numbers, facts. Proof that food plus rest equaled staying. She noted the weight on a sticky note and pressed it to the fridge beside an old grocery list Daniel had written in block letters. Milk, coffee, nails for the birdhouse. The two lists leaned on each other. Trust, of course, wasn't a straight climb. A pot clanged once, and he vanished under the couch, silent and boneless, only his eyes left to claim him. She lay on the floor and spoke low until the air itself softened. And after long minutes, his whiskers appeared, then his nose, then a paw. He came out backwards, as if unwilling to meet the moment head-on. She pretended not to notice, and the dignity of that pretend mended the small tear the clatter had made. On a clear afternoon, she opened the back door to sweep the doormat. Cold slid in, pine and frost. Ash came to the threshold and sat, pupils narrowing at the brightness of snow on the far hill where the creek cut its thin silver line. Air moved in his nose, full of news. He didn't step across, not yet. He tucked his paws, tail-wrapped, and watched the world as if relearning the grammar of distance. She stood beside him, broom held still. Two silhouettes in the doorway, the human and the wild thing, resting in the single thin place where indoors and out touch. The creek's sound threaded through the quiet. A faint, continuous whisper of movement. Continuity. She thought of the first time she had stood by that water with Daniel. Their boots leaving 2 clean arcs in new snow, his breath making small clouds that drifted into hers. She let that memory come. It didn't break her. It sat down beside her like an old friend and folded its hands. By the end of 2 weeks, Ash had learned the house's seasons by light. Morning meant warmth, building under the vent, and the soft chime that marked the kettle's readiness. Afternoon meant sun slab on the floorboards where he could stretch his spine until it lengthened into a single, graceful line. Evening meant soup, simmering and the windows turning to mirrors so he could regard the cat in the glass and decide each time not to hiss at the apparition. He had learned her rhythms too, the way she rubbed one thumb over the other when thinking, the small cough she made just before a laugh, the way she touched the scarf's fringe when she felt the weight of quiet rise. Once, when she paused in the studio doorway, brush lifted but not landing, he rose, crossed the room, and set a paw on her shoe. Light as a feather, steady as a vow, she inhaled, lowered the brush, and let the first careful strokes of his shape appear on the white. The blunt tail, the mapping spots, the ear tufts like quotation marks around an unspoken sentence. That night, she placed the finished sketch on the mantel. Not to show anyone. To keep the proof where the house could see it. The next morning, the porch held new tracks, coyote probably, looping along the fence line like commas between the trees. Ash saw them from the window and went very still, his body drawing into the old, wild geometry of caution. She turned away from the glass, so he wouldn't have to hold it alone. She filled the bowls, she warmed the scarf. She said his name once, and he blinked, and the spell of the tracks loosened. Routine again, the life-saving domestic. It could not last, she knew, not like this. They were building a bridge to somewhere neither of them could see yet. But for now, there was breath and warmth and the quiet bravery of small, repeated gestures. The feather lay on the floor near the vent, a pale crescent of memory. When she picked it up and set it on the windowsill, Ash watched the motion with grave approval, as if he were consenting to the day. Later, when wind scraped thin snow across the clearing and dusk came early, he surprised her. He rose from the scarf, padded to the back door, and placed one paw against the wood, not scratching, pressing, asking. She reached for the knob, heart tightening without reason she could name. On the other side, the world waited. She knew this couldn't last, but her heart was already speaking otherwise. The first snow came early that year, heavy and wet, bending the pines toward the earth. Evelyn woke to a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. But the space where Ash usually slept, curled at the foot of her bed, a warm weight against her ankles, was empty. She called softly into the house, then louder into the yard. Nothing. By afternoon, worry had set in. She walked the property, following his small, rounded prints until they vanished at the tree line. The forest beyond was a pale labyrinth of falling flakes. Somewhere in that white quiet, the wild was calling him back. Over the next days, she searched, miles of woodland trails, her voice hoarse from calling his name. Neighbors saw her on the roadside, peering into ditches, her coat dusted with frost. She left food at the edge of the trees, untouched except by crows. Each evening she'd return home to the hollow sound of the wind under the eaves, the absence in the rooms more deafening than any noise. The truth she had tried to ignore pressed in. Ash had been born to this wilderness. No matter the warmth she offered, his heart beat to the rhythm of leaves, frost, and moonlight. But knowing didn't make the loss less sharp. One night, a snowstorm drove her back early from the search. The house smelled faintly of pine logs burning. She thought she saw movement at the window, but it was only the reflection of her own tired face. She pressed her hand to the glass, remembering the first day he'd stepped from the forest, ribs showing, eyes full of quiet defiance. The next morning, fresh snow lay unmarked across the yard. No tracks led to her door. And still she listened for him. She had saved him once. Could she do it again? It was late January when the sound came, a faint, deliberate scrape at the back door. Not wind, not branch. Evelyn was in the kitchen, hands deep in dishwater. She froze, her breath rising in a pale ribbon before she even reached the door. Outside, the world was dim with dusk, the snow an unbroken sheet except for a single path of prints leading up to the porch. She opened the door slowly, the wood groaning in the cold. And there he was. Ash stood in the blue half-light, larger now, the rosettes on his coat sharper, his stance surer. But the eyes, the green, steady gaze, were the same. Snow dusted his ears, clung to the thick fur along his legs. He didn't move forward, only blinked once, slow and deliberate. For a moment, Neither of them moved. The air between them was full of everything unspoken, the weeks apart, the nights she'd imagined him gone forever, the days he'd spent relearning the wild. Then without sound, he stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under his weight. Evelyn knelt, her knees catching the cold. She extended her hand, palm up, fingers trembling. Ash lowered his head, sniffed the air around her skin, and pressed the blunt of his forehead to her knuckles. The contact was brief, but it was enough to unravel the knot in her chest. He didn't cross the threshold. Instead, he turned and walked to the edge of the porch, pausing once to look back. His tail twitched. The message was clear. I am here. I am whole. But I am still mine. She followed him into the yard, boots sinking into the soft crust of snow. At the tree line, he stopped beside the old cedar where she'd once seen him watch the clearing. From the shadows, another shape emerged, a second bobcat, taller, heavier, fur thick against the winter. A female. Her eyes were sharp, but not hostile. Ash stepped toward her, brushed his side along hers in a gesture of claim and kinship. Then he looked back at Evelyn one last time. The slow blink came again, deliberate as a heartbeat. She returned it, her vision blurring with the cold and the sting of something deeper. They vanished into the trees, silent as the falling snow. She stood there long after the shapes had gone, her breath rising in the dark. The yard was quiet again, the porch light throwing a warm circle on the white ground. She knew he might return, or he might not. The wild would decide. When she went back inside, she found the indigo scarf still folded by the vent, the small down feather tucked beneath it. She left them there, just in case. She understood now, love wasn't meant to be caged, but neither was it meant to be forgotten. Winter lingered deep into March. The clearing stayed white until the sun finally began to eat away at the drift, revealing damp earth and the first green points of grass. Evelyn's days resumed their quiet rhythm, but the silence no longer felt like an empty room. It felt like a pause between notes. Some mornings she'd wake to find new tracks in the yard, not close to the house, never reckless, but near enough to see their rounded shape, the careful spacing of each step. Once, on a day when fog hung low over the pines, she found the remains of a rabbit by the fence line, fresh, the work of a skilled hunter. She knew without proof it was his, a quiet offering, left without ceremony. The scarf stayed by the vent. The feather, now slightly frayed at the edges, remained on the windowsill. She didn't move them. They were no longer just reminders, they were part of the house, as much as the wind chime or the pine-smelling wood of the walls. In the studio, the painting had changed. What had begun as a sketch of a small, fragile cub now carried the shape of something larger, stronger, and free. She'd painted the clearing behind him, the pines lifting into a sky streaked with winter light. His gaze in the painting met hers, steady and unbroken. She signed it in the lower corner, not for sale, not for anyone else's wall. One evening, as the sun bled gold along the ridge, she stepped onto the porch and saw movement in the tree line. Ash stood there, a dark silhouette against the fading light. He didn't come forward, and she didn't call. They simply watched each other across the space, the air between them thick with recognition. After a moment he turned, disappearing into the trees. The chimes stirred with the breeze, letting go a single, round note. Evelyn stayed on the porch until the last of the light was gone. Then she went inside, closed the door softly, and let the quiet settle. Some bonds don't live inside walls. They run in the spaces between, in the tracks left on fresh snow, in the slow blink of trust given and returned. And some stories, she thought, don't need an ending, only the knowing that they go on. If this story touched your heart, stay close. Here, we believe some bonds never end.